Get that disgusting eyesore off my waterfront. Margaret Langford's voice cut through the morning stillness like a rusty saw blade as she marched straight onto my private dock, the one my family has owned outright since 1999. Two HOA board members trailed behind her, looking like they'd rather be anywhere else on Earth, while Margaret snapped pictures of my fishing boat with her phone as if she were documenting a hazardous waste spill. "This ugly piece of junk is ruining the entire neighborhood," she announced to the quiet lake and anyone within earshot. I sat there with my coffee going cold, feeling my blood pressure climb, but I kept my face calm. 20 years I've owned this place. 20 years of paying taxes, maintaining the dock, improving the shoreline. And now this woman was standing on my planks demanding I get rid of a perfectly legal boat because she didn't like the way it looked. I was 57 years old enough to know that the loudest person in the argument is usually the weakest. So I just watched her and waited. Margaret Langford wore the uniform of suburban authority, navy blazer, pearls, clipboard clutched like a shield. Behind her stood Walter Brooks and Susan Delaney, both shifting from foot to foot, clearly wishing they'd called in sick to this particular board meeting. Margaret kept talking, something about property values and community standards and aesthetic guidelines, words she threw around like they were written on stone tablets. When I finally spoke, my voice was quiet. "Margaret, this dock was built 4 years before the HOA even existed. It's private property." I watched the flicker of uncertainty cross her face before the righteous mask slammed back down. "Visibility from common areas gives us jurisdiction," she declared. "We have every right to enforce standards on anything that impacts the neighborhood's image." She handed me a formal notice, thick paper, official seal, 14-day compliance deadline. I took it without reading, folded it once, and slipped it into my shirt pocket. 14 days, I repeated. That seems reasonable. The way I said it made her pause. She had come expecting a fight or immediate surrender. Instead, she got polite agreement and a question she couldn't answer cleanly. What, exactly, were the written standards that defined ugly? She left with her little entourage, heels clicking like a timer on a bomb. I stayed on the dock a long time after they were gone, staring at my 2009 Grady White. The gel coat was faded, there were a few scratches along the hull, and the canvas top had seen better decades. But she ran like a sewing machine, started on the first turn of the key every time, and she was mine. Paid for free and clear the year my youngest graduated high school. I made 2 decisions that morning. First, I wasn't moving the boat. Second, I was going to make Margaret regret ever setting foot on my property. Most people would have lawyered up right then or started a screaming match across the water. I did neither. I opened a new folder on my laptop titled Langford Documentation and began writing down every word, every gesture, every expression. Then I started making phone calls, quiet ones, to neighbors who had been on the receiving end of Margaret's clipboard crusade. Ellen Ramsey answered on the second ring. She laughed when I asked if the HOA had ever threatened her over anything ridiculous. "Kevin, they fined me $800 because my mailbox post was supposedly 2 inches too tall." 2 inches. I paid it because I didn't have the energy to fight. George Harlan was next. They made me repaint my perfectly good green garage door beige because it didn't harmonize with the streetscape. There is no written color palette, Kevin. Margaret just decides what she likes and calls everything else a violation. The worst story belonged to Ruth Caldwell, 79 years old, who met me at her door with tears in her eyes and a ceramic frog in her hand. They're threatening to lien my house over lawn ornaments. 40 years these frogs have sat by my front walk. 40 years. Now there's suddenly a blight on the community. By the end of the week, I had a clear picture. Margaret's power rested on 2 things: vague covenant language about community standards and the assumption that no one would push back hard enough to force her to define those standards in writing. She was about to learn what happens when someone does. The 14th day after her notice arrived at 7:30 on a Tuesday morning with the roar of a diesel engine. Margaret rolled up in her black Escalade, followed by a flatbed tow truck big enough to haul a house, and a silver BMW carrying the rest of her enforcement squad. The driver, a guy named Ray Carter, looked skeptical from the moment he stepped down from the cab. Margaret was in full battle mode, blazer crisp, clipboard ready. "Compliance deadline has passed," she announced loud enough for the growing crowd of neighbors to hear. "The board has authorized immediate removal." Ray scratched his head. "Ma'am, I'm going to need something a little more official than an HOA letter. Like a court order, or at least sheriff standby." Margaret waved the resolution like it was the Constitution. "This is sufficient authority." Ray glanced at me, then back at her. "Lady, I haul cars for a living. I've done repo work, I've done abandoned vehicle calls, but I've never pulled a boat off a private dock because somebody thinks it's ugly. I'm out unless the sheriff tells me different." The neighbors were gathering now, coffee cups in hand, phones out. Ellen, George, Ruth, a dozen others. Someone started filming. Margaret made her fatal mistake right there in front of God and half the subdivision. She raised her voice so everyone could hear. "The board has absolute authority to remove anything we determine to be inappropriate for community standards. Boats, decorations, landscaping, anything. That is our job, and we will do it." I waited until she finished, then spoke just loud enough for the phones to catch it. "So you're confirming on record that the HOA claims the right to remove any private property its members personally find unattractive, with no written standards and no legal jurisdiction check?" "Exactly," she snapped, too angry to see the trap close. "Reasonable people know what belongs here and what doesn't." Ray Carter shook his head, climbed back into his truck, and left. The The tow truck rumbling away was the sound of Margaret's authority hitting its first speed bump. 3 days later, the county code compliance inspector showed up at my door. Turns out several residents, including one very determined 79-year-old with a ceramic frog, had filed complaints after the tow truck circus. Inspector Ramirez spent 2 hours reviewing my deed, the original 1999 dock permit, and the HOA covenants. Then he scheduled a public hearing. The community center was packed. Margaret arrived with a downtown attorney in a $5,000 suit. I showed up in jeans and boat shoes, carrying a single folder. The attorney laid out the HOA's case, covenants, community standards, property values, the usual noise. Margaret couldn't resist adding her own commentary about eyesores and neighborhood character. When it was my turn, I kept it short. Mrs. Langford has publicly stated that the board has absolute authority to remove anything its members find unattractive. I played the phone videos, 3 different angles, crystal clear. Then I opened my folder and read from the county survey, showing my dock lies completely outside HOA jurisdiction. I read the covenant sections that require objective, written standards for any enforcement action. There are none. Then I turned Margaret's own logic back on her. Using the precedent she established, I filed a formal complaint against the HOA board for behavior that is, by their own definition, the ugliest thing in this neighborhood, systematic harassment of residents based on personal aesthetic preference. I listed the fines, the threats, the attempted illegal towing. I had statements from Ellen, George, Ruth, and 9 others. Margaret's attorney tried to object, but Inspector Ramirez was already taking notes. When Ruth Caldwell stood up, walker and all, and held up her ceramic frog for the entire room to see, something shifted. One by one, neighbors started speaking. The room that had once been afraid of Margaret Langford suddenly wasn't afraid anymore. The ruling came down the following week. The county found that the HOA had no jurisdiction over my dock, that their enforcement actions lacked objective standards and constituted harassment, and that I, as private property owner, had the absolute right to restrict access to anyone who had engaged in documented threatening behavior toward me or my property. I put up a sign the next day. Private dock. Access restricted by County Order 2024-1883 to individuals engaged in harassment of residents. All others welcome for fishing with respect for the property. Margaret tested it first, of course. She marched down with a printed copy of some covenant page, demanding her rights. I pointed to the sign and to the county order taped beneath it. She left red-faced. Walter tried the nice guy approach a week later. Susan sent her grandchildren with puppy dog eyes. Same answer every time. 6 months later, the dock was busier than it had ever been. Kids learned to cast from the same planks their parents once feared to walk. My weathered Grady White became the official community education boat, complete with life jackets in every size. The HOA, under new leadership that actually read the covenants, sent out a newsletter apologizing for past overreach and promising written, objective standards going forward. Margaret moved away that winter. Word is she took an HOA presidency in Arizona. Some habits die hard. One Tuesday morning last spring, a familiar figure appeared at the edge of my property line. Margaret Langford, no blazer, no clipboard, just jeans and a sun hat. She stood there a long time before she spoke. Mind if I would align? She asked, voice softer than I'd ever heard it. I looked at her for a long moment, then handed her a permit form, the same one every other neighbor fills out. Standard rules apply, I said. Respect the place, respect the people, leave it better than you found it. She signed without a word and took the farthest corner of the dock. We fished in silence until the sun was high. She caught a nice bass, held it up for a second, then released it. As she reeled in her line to leave, she paused. The boat looks good out here, she said. I just nodded. Sometimes that's apology enough. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever watched someone wield petty power until the system finally said enough? When does standing your ground cross into something that feels like injustice in return? And when ordinary people are bullied in their own homes, where is the line between fighting back and becoming the new bully? Drop your stories and your honest take in the comments. I read every one.